Thank you for joining the First Unitarian Church of Houston for our weekly online ministers forum. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bossen, Senior Minister of the congregation. These programs are conversations with community organizers, scholars, religious leaders, artists, and others about how we can collectively address the present crises. Their purpose is to offer members of our community and all who wish to join us online science-based resources and liberation-oriented inspiration to get us through these difficult times. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Kim Waller. She's an associate professor of the University of Texas School of Public Health. The views she is expressing are hers alone and not necessarily endorsed by her institution. Dr. Waller has a degree in nursing science and a PhD in epidemiology from the University of California, Berkeley. She has 7 years of hospital experience as a nurse and over 20 years of experience as an epidemiologist. For those of you who are with us for the first time, let me say a few words about Unitarian Universalism. We are a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe we need not think alike to love alike. We hope that you find these forums a source of connection, hope, and clarity. Dr. Waller, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Reverend Bossen. It's my great pleasure to be here this morning. It's a wonderful opportunity to speak to people about the development of vaccines to prevent transmission of COVID-19.
Well, we're very excited to have you with us, and I thought if you could actually just start out with a very basic question of what is a vaccine?
Yeah, that's a good question. I try to be as basic as possible. Essentially, what humans have been doing for centuries now is taking some of the material that causes an infection and attenuating it in some way so that hopefully it no longer causes an infection, and injecting it to allow the person receiving the injection to develop protective antibodies. And, I'll just say a little word about how the smallpox vaccine was developed. It was the first vaccine. For many centuries back, we had smallpox. It was causing disfigurement. It had a 50% mortality in the world. And what they first did was they would take, as people probably know, smallpox causes this eruption of pustules, fluid-filled pustules, and they would take material out of the pustules of an infected person and put it into the skin of an uninfected person that they wanted to protect. And it did protect a lot of people, but you have to realize the disease had a 50% mortality rate, and this procedure had a 10% mortality rate, which is to say that it wasn't very perfect, and a lot of people would die from the actual procedure. So it really wasn't a vaccine yet, but it was a procedure to lessen the risk of smallpox. And then around about 1790 there was a physician named Jenner who's become famous because he was the one who, the idea of developing the vaccine was out there, but he was the one that really developed it and wrote a scientific paper about it and was giving it to people. So what they knew was, it was known, long before Jenner, that there was a disease called cowpox that people would get from cows. It was mild, but it seemed to be related to smallpox. And it seemed that people who got the cowpox, they didn't get smallpox. Specifically the milkmaids that would milk the cows, they would always get cowpox, but they were immune from smallpox. And so what Jenner did, and other people had tried a little bit before him, is he would get a pustule from somebody with the cowpox, and then he would inject somebody with that pustule, and they would get the cowpox, which was called, the word for cow in Latin is vacca. The cowpox was called vaccinia. So that's where we get the word vaccine, is from the cowpox disease, the cow disease. He would inject that disease into people. They'd get the cowpox, and it would protect them from smallpox. So that was the first smallpox vaccine. And Dr. Jenner goes down. There were many people involved, but he goes down as getting the credit. He was not the one to come up with the idea, but he certainly was, implementation is very important. So that is, some variation of that is every vaccine that we have.
So, but today there are new ways of developing vaccines, right? I mean, like we're no longer scraping pustules for, the matter of the virus or whatever to inject into people. So, how are people developing vaccines today? Like, how have we gone from scraping cowpox pustules to, vaccines for measles, mumps, and rubella or whatever? The flu vaccine today?
Yeah, I will try to answer this pretty simply, and I'll ask for hopefully a slide to be inserted here. The conventional method that most existing vaccines are based on requires you to grow the virus or the microorganism. You grow the virus, and then you get the component of the virus that you want to direct the vaccine at. And for almost every vaccine under development right now for novel coronavirus, you'll see the spike proteins there, and that's the target for almost every vaccine under development. So what they want to do is develop antibodies against that spike protein, because that spike protein is necessary to unite with the receptor on the cell, and that's how the virus would enter the cell. And so the conventional method requires growing these viruses, takes a long time, and it is very slow to scale up millions of doses of a vaccine with the conventional method. So the new method, which people call the next generation or the new generation method, is, we'll look at the second slide here, which will show you the interior of the virus, and you see in there the genetic code that allows the virus to replicate. They can only replicate inside of a living being. They don't live unless they're inside of someone. Anyway, that's a genetic code. So what they're doing now is they're taking the genetic code, and thanks to the Chinese, who sequenced the entire code and gave it to the world very rapidly, they have the genetic code, and then they will identify the part of the genetic code that codes for the spike virus. And they'll take that and they'll inject it into people. So if they injected me with the part of the genetic code for the spike virus, my body would say, oh, look, let's take this code and start manufacturing. So my body would start making spike protein. And when my immune system sees the spike protein, my immune system would make antibodies to it and protect me against infection with the novel coronavirus. So that's the new generation, is all based on the genetic code. But it's much more rapid to scale up. And that's why the first vaccines that we're going to see are going to be new generation based on the genetic code.
So I guess I have two sort of follow-up questions. One is that it's viral matter, but not the whole virus that's getting injected in these new generation vaccines?
Right. It's not the whole virus. And so it won't cause infection. It's not a live vaccine. It's just, I don't think they even use any part of the virus. I think they just they know the sequence, so they just synthesize that part of the code. Mm-hmm. They just synthesize the code for the spike protein. So,
I mean, a common question people have about a lot of vaccines. I mean, you mentioned live virus, right? And you mentioned earlier, well, the cowpox and the smallpox were, well, I mean, not the cowpox, the smallpox vaccine was often lethal to some people. And so a common question people have today about vaccines is, how safe are they? There's a whole anti-vaccination movement. So can you address the safety of vaccines?
Sure. Yes, there are live vaccines. And the polio vaccine, there were two polio vaccines, and one is a live vaccine. I think one of the measles vaccine is live. So now in the modern world, we know how to attenuate a virus, even if it's going to be a live virus, so that it does not cause disease. I mean, we're good at that. The first vaccines that are going to come out for the novel coronavirus are not going to be alive. and they're going to be tested on, they are currently under clinical trials, and they have enrolled for each vaccine. They have a separate clinical trial because every vaccine is different. And their main issue is, are they going to be effective? But they're randomizing 30 to 40,000 people in each clinical trial. So what happens is a person enters the clinical trial and they'll be randomized to either get the vaccine or get a placebo. And everybody's blind. The patient is blind. The doctors are blind. Nobody knows who gets what except the person keeping the code. And then they follow people for about 6 to 9 months to see what kind, if they get any disease or they have any complaints. And then at the end, they break the code and they compare the people who actually got the vaccine with those who got the placebo. So they can, they're not gonna, there's gonna be a lot of complaints, healthcare complaints in that number of people, but you wanna see whether there's an increase in any particular complaint among those who got the vaccine. So I think at the point people are getting the vaccine, they can know that for short-term, immediate allergic reactions or any kind of short-term thing in the first 6 to 9 months, that it's been checked in half of 30,000, which would be 15,000 people or more.
So 2 things. I think one, the process you're talking about is usually called double-blind testing, correct? Yeah. I mean, just because that's a term that people get thrown out, and you provided in the media, and you provided a great explanation of how it works. So.
Yeah, they have double blind, triple blind. I get a little confused about the difference between the two, but yeah, they blind everyone they can. The patient is always blinded. The doctors deciding on the diagnosis should be blinded.
So, and then I think the other thing, though, when we're talking about the safety of vaccines, that is probably good to hear your reflections on or your information about is additives to vaccines, because I know that within the anti-vax movement, like the vaccines containing mercury and this supposedly having a link to increased autism has been like one of the big things that people have kind of thrown around about, like why we shouldn't be doing vaccines. So what kind of additives are added to vaccines beyond just kind of the viral matter or the and is mercury one of them? And what kind of impact do those additives have?
They have to, for the genetic vaccines, the new generation vaccines, they have a lipid coat that they're putting around the genetic material. They have to have that there because the genetic material is very fragile. But it's just a lipid coat. And then they may have adjuvants, which are additives that help increase the effectiveness of the vaccine. Sometimes they use aluminum. I don't know whether they're using it in these, but I do know that they're not going to have any preservatives. So there won't be any mercury. CDC and the nation at large has taken mercury out of almost every virus. And it was there as a preservative so that the vaccine, they've taken mercury out of almost every vaccine. And the mercury was there to preserve it. In other words, to prevent the vial from becoming infected with bacteria. So it had a purpose there. But these vaccines are going to have, the first 2 that come out, we think are going to have to be stored at incredibly low temperatures, well below freezing, to prevent degradation and also to prevent bacteria from infecting the vial. But they're not going to have any preservatives in them. The first one's coming out. I think I'm not worried about the adjuvants. If they're there, and it will vary from one vaccine to another, they are there to increase the effectiveness of the vaccine. I think it's really important to say that childhood vaccines do not cause autism. They have gone through the same randomized clinical trials, and it has been shown many times over that they don't cause autism. The problem happened because the timing of the vaccine, children would develop up to a certain point, and then if they had autism, they would stop developing certain hallmarks of development. There were children who had autism who would regress and stop talking. Mm-hmm. And that was happening, the timing of the autism becoming apparent was happening right after some of the vaccines were given. And so that caused the impression in parents that the vaccine had caused autism. But remember, we have a whole group that doesn't receive the, we have a whole group that doesn't receive the vaccine. That's the placebo group. And so in the placebo group, you would have just as many children with autism as in the group that got the childhood vaccine. So no, childhood vaccines do not cause autism.
And I think you just, oh, go ahead.
Plenty of research on that, but unfortunately people still think it's true.
Well, and I think that you just mentioned an important reality and scientific analysis of correlation and causation are different things, right? If two things are correlated, they happen at the same time. That doesn't necessarily mean that one caused the other. And yet we constantly have people, this is a thing that just happens widely throughout society. People say, oh, this thing happened and this thing happened, so they must be related. Well, there could be lots of reasons why those things happened at the same time. And you just gave a very good explanation of why autism often emerges at the same time that childhood vaccines are given, right? They're not
exactly.
One does not cause the other. It's just that they happen to be correlated in terms of developmental milestones for children.
It's got to be heart-wrenching to see your child start regressing in those milestones. So,
absolutely,
our heart goes out to those parents. But no, those vaccines do not cause autism.
We're now talking about vaccines and the rapidity at which they are being developed. And there's a program that the current administration has put into place called Operation Warp Speed. So what is Operation Warp Speed?
Yeah, this was one of the interesting things I researched a little because I have sort of been ignoring it. It is a public-private partnership that was put together in the U.S. with the goal, one of the goals for vaccines is to get out about 300 million doses of the vaccine starting in January and the next few months. That was kind of their time frame to get those doses out of one vaccine or another. So what they did was they got all these groups together. They got the people that are manufacturing the vaccine, the people that are making the vaccine. They got CDC, of course, Food and Drug Administration, which is the agency that has to look at all the data when somebody says my vaccine is ready to go, and they have to decide whether to approve it or not. National Institutes of Health, and then they have private people like private companies, and there are people like Mike Bloomberg, who he's on one of the videos. I think he may have given money, but he seems to be part of Operation Warp Speed. And all these people, it's a massive coming together. And I think in some ways it really seems to be working, at least for the vaccines, because what they did was instead of having phase 1 clinical trial, which is kind of an initial safety, phase 2 dosage, phase 3, the big scale up to 30,000 people, I think they did put phase 1 and phase 2 together. And then even though the phase 3 is just finishing, they're still in phase 3, the first 2 vaccines. The final data is not out yet. They're going ahead and making millions of doses of those 2 vaccines. They're already making those doses. And they're just hoping that at the end of those trials, the data will look good and they'll be approved by the FDA. There's a lot of pressure on the group in the FDA to do emergency authorization or approve them in some way. And so Operation Warp Speed has already spent $10 billion on, I'm not sure whether it's all taxpayer money or some of it's from Mike Bloomberg. I didn't get into that, but they have spent $10 billion. And they have some other things they're doing. They're also trying to help scale up the monoclonal antibodies. And they're working on one or two of those.
So
let me just say before you ask the next question, and I wanted to emphasize that Operation Warp Speed is focusing on about 8 different types of vaccines for the coronavirus right now. That's overwhelming.
So I wanted to actually ask a follow-up question. What are monoclonal antibodies? How does that relate to the coronavirus and treatment, and why is that part of Operation Warp Speed?
Certainly. Definition of monoclonal antibodies. You can break the word monoclonal down into one for mono, and clonal refers to clone. So what it means is a therapy of it where you give antibodies, but all the antibodies you're given are directed at the same part of the virus. They could even be directed at just one part of the spike protein. So you're giving a therapy and an infusion usually of antibodies where all the antibodies are exactly the same. You can contrast that with an infusion of polyclonal antibodies where the antibodies in the infusion are directed at more than one place on the virus.
But that's a treatment for people who are already sick, as opposed to a vaccine, preventative treatment.
Yeah, that is what they're calling a therapeutic, which means it's a therapy for people that are sick. But the Operation Warp Speed is also supposed to be working on therapeutics. And, they want to get around 30 million doses. The U.S. population is 320 million. But ultimately, I think their goal is global vaccination. But they want to vaccinate Americans first.
We could get into a long discussion of the politics of that, but I think we want to stick to vaccinations in general as a sort of general topic. We've already heard about people. We've got 8 vaccines in development. We've already heard about people that are planning on not taking the vaccine for the novel coronavirus, or saying that they don't want to be in the first round of people who take it. So could you talk a bit about that?
Only 50% of adults in the U.S. took the flu vaccine last year. So we're not overly surprised that the most recent survey, we did have 70% of adults in the U.S. saying that they would take the novel coronavirus vaccine, but that has now dropped to 50%. So everyone's disappointed about that. Most of the people said their reason was concern about safety. And I think a lot of people do just want to wait and see what happens to people who they know who take it. And that's why I'm trying to get the word out that as you take that vaccine, be assured that at least 15,000 people have taken it in a clinical trial. So if something really terrible is going to happen to you, we probably would know. It's a pretty big clinical trial. People, and in fact, unfortunately, Blacks and Hispanics are a little bit more likely to say they're not going to take it. And Blacks have a higher risk of mortality from COVID-19. So that's a concern. So I do think that church members, we might want to focus on this because, we're not great in this country on doing things for the common good. And I'm going to try to force myself to do what I'm recommended to do, even though I, like everyone else, I like to have control. And since I know something about these vaccines, I might be tempted to say, I'm not too wild about this vaccine. I think this one's coming out next month. I'll wait for that one, but in reality, there are countries where people just follow along with the public health recommendation, and those countries have done really well in this pandemic. So I think we should try in this particular situation to really follow the public health recommendation for the greater good, even if it's not for your good.
I think 2 things I kind of want to say in response. One is, I think that, in terms of the countries that have followed the health recommendations, you're absolutely correct. And it's been, I think, a real challenge here to see how that's gotten politicized because, we could be, if everybody would just wear a mask, we would be seeing a different experience than we have had here in the United States. Because we can look at all these other countries where they've made different choices. And I think that, it's, I guess, a message here to everybody who's watching, just a reminder that, if you're wearing a mask, it's not just about you and protecting you. It's about you protecting other people from you if you're carrying the virus. And that, like, by making those kind of public interventions, individual choices,
Yeah,
they really
and
add up.
like I don't wear a mask when I'm outside because I believe the outside is very safe. But I was walking across the medical center and outside, and about half of people would have on masks. So I felt comfortable. But for some reason, in the last 2 months, now everybody who's outside in the medical center has on a mask. So now I wear a mask because I think there's also just you don't want to offend or appear to not be following regulations, you know?
Yeah.
I still feel that it would be safe to walk across the medical center. I don't come close to anybody, but I now, when I walk across the medical center outside, I now have a mask on.
Yeah, and I mean, I will say I wear a mask when I'm out walking in public, or even when I'm riding my bike, mostly because I feel like it has become such a polarized situation. I just want to sort of offer up a kind of moral example of, like, wear a mask in public.
Yeah.
To try to normalize it. Not so because like everything I've read is that, well, if you're out in public in not a crowded environment, doesn't particularly make one difference or another if there's not a lot of other people around. But there is this sort of like, well, those are people wearing masks. Maybe I should wear a mask. I mean, you sort of just gave a story about that, right? And like, I want to wear a mask to encourage other people wearing masks so that when I go into a grocery store, everybody's wearing a mask.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back actually and respond to just one thing that you said when you were talking about why African Americans and Hispanics are more reluctant to take masks or vaccines. And I do think it's important to like recognize that that's not just sort of like kind of an anomalous, thing, but that there is a long and unfortunate history of medical experimentation, particularly like the Tuskegee Institute's, experiments that has sowed distrust in the African American and Latinx communities.
I think particularly in the African American community, we see lower participation rates in clinical trials. And so vaccination, different things. We know there's a trust issue, and there's really been a focus on trying to get a lot of minorities into these clinical trials that I was talking about. I don't know how well they're doing on that. Obviously, it's voluntary, and but they're really trying to have a diverse enrollment.
So, I mean, not only is there this difficult history of medical experimentation, which is, really egregious, and forced sterilization and the eugenics movement that is like well documented and has had a very strong is a reason why there's a lot of distrust amongst the African American community or African American communities towards things like vaccine trials. But also, I think it's important to recognize that because of the racial injustices in this country, a lot of African Americans and Hispanics are less likely to have primary care physicians and less likely to have health insurance. And so they're less likely to have a trusting relationship with a doctor who is telling them, this is safe to do, that's safe to do. They're often seeing, poor people and people without insurance are often seeing doctors really only at moments of extreme crisis. And so they don't have that trusting relationship where, like I go to my primary care physician and he's like, you should take your flu vaccine. So I go and get my flu vaccine, right? And I think that failure in our public health system really is sort of notable at this particular time.
I recommend if people don't know where to go, because we're going to talk about the flu vaccine at the end here, I recommend people go to Walgreens or another chain because the pharmacists are giving the vaccines and they're really good at it. So you've got a really highly trained professional that you can ask questions of. and they're going to maintain the coldness of the vaccine and all of that really well because it's a pharmacy.
Well, that's I think good information to have.
I would not be big myself on going to a little tiny clinic for a vaccine that just came out.
Mm-hmm.
I would go to a big pharmacy. That's just me. I think they're more likely to have kept the virus cold, and therefore it's effective.
Well, I mean, I'm more of, I mean, like for me, I get the flu vaccine now because every year because my primary care physician is like, you should get the flu vaccine. I'm not saying I actually necessarily get it from him. I mean, he tends to send me to clinics to do, all testing and things like that.
Right.
I want to talk about who's going to receive the vaccine first, because I think that, right, you said that there's going to be, I think, 30 million doses probably available initially.
Maybe more by January, and it's gonna go to, traditionally it will go to healthcare workers first for obvious reasons.
Right.
And then after that, it will go probably to the most susceptible populations, meaning people over age 60 and people with an underlying health condition that makes them more susceptible to severe disease. However, I want to say something about the rollout because there's a really good article in the Atlantic at the end of September on how complicated the rollout is going to be. Mm-hmm. Be prepared for at least maybe 2 vaccines to roll out at the same time. They'll both be next generation genetic material vaccines, and each of them is probably going to require 2 injections. So you get the injection once, you have to return in 30 days and get the injection. Everybody's going to have to maintain the vaccine at these really low temperatures, which is going to be hard for some clinics. It's going to be in multi-dose vials without preservatives, which means they have to keep those vials really cold and they have to draw more than 1 dose out of a vial. We ran out of the glass for the single dose vials, so it sounds like we're using multi-dose vials. That goes back 40 years when I started in nursing. It's crazy, but it's going to be a complicated rollout. And then just when you're about to get your vaccine, you may suddenly hear another vaccine is going to come out in 2 weeks. They're going to start coming out like that. And maybe that one coming out next is going to only require 1 injection. So there is going to be a lot of choice and a lot of potential confusion and complication when the viruses start coming out.
In the vaccines.
I'm sorry, the vaccines. I keep saying virus instead of vaccines. It's going to be very complicated. Thanks for correcting me on that, because I don't want to lead people astray by misspeaking. Yeah. But it's going to be very complicated when they come out. And the other issue is going to be some of the vaccines, the genetic vaccines are probably going to be less effective than the more conventional ones. And so some people will be thinking about waiting for the more conventional vaccine. But, there may be a 2-tier strategy where they say everybody that's susceptible take this vaccine, the high susceptibility group, and the low susceptibility group take this vaccine. There may be a strategy like that. And so I'm just going to do what I'm supposed to do for my group, because somebody has thought about this a lot more than I have.
Yeah.
But, we all like to have control and kind of go our own way in the United States. But I'm trying to focus on people going with the public health recommendation.
I did want to ask you something based on the sort of vaccine rollout, and you can just say you don't want to speculate on this at all, but would you be willing to speculate on if vaccines start to be available in January, at what point it might be safe to sort of start to have larger scale gatherings, again?
I don't think I should speculate on that. It's going to depend on how effective the vaccines are and how many people take the vaccines. Because we don't really know how many people are going to get the vaccine yet.
Yeah. Okay.
But I do want to talk about the flu vaccine right here at the end, and I know we're over time, but let me just say something about the flu vaccine. Because everybody should hopefully be getting the flu vaccine right about now. And I went to the website of CDC, and there are 8 different flu vaccines,
oh, wow.
just to make life complicated. But I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. There's a super duper vaccine for people over 65 where they give you more of the stimulus. And that's because elderly people my age and older, do not respond as well to vaccines. So they need more of a stimulus to get the antibodies. So that's for older people. There is a vaccine that is not made with eggs for anybody who's allergic to eggs. And then there's something there's just the standard flu vaccine. And then there's a nasal spray vaccine for influenza if you don't want an injection. That one is only for people aged 2 to 49. The nasal spray vaccine is a live vaccine. It is safe. I want to talk about what Dr. Gallo said last week on NPR about the nasal spray flu vaccine. Dr. Gallo, if you don't remember who he is, real famous guy, his scientific team was one of 2 teams that isolated the virus for AIDS. So he's very famous in public health infectious disease. And he came out and he said, you know, you might want to think about taking the nasal spray vaccine because it's a live vaccine. And it looks like live vaccines may have a kind of general property of preventing all respiratory pathogens. And that's not what we think about vaccines. Usually we think about one vaccine preventing one pathogen, but it's coming out that certain vaccines, live vaccines, it is what he's talking about, may prevent and help prevent infection with all pathogens. And they've got a clinical trial going of the live vaccine for tuberculosis. We don't use it in this country, it's called BCG. But they're looking at whether BCG, taking that live vaccine, will generally reduce your chance of any respiratory infection. And if it proves to be true, we've already got millions of doses of BCG. It's been given to millions of people all over the world. So there could be a solution coming with these vaccines that already exist. And I never would have said anything about this, but Dr. Gallo, I don't think he would come out and say this if he didn't think there was a lot of evidence. He's a very respected scientist. So I'm just telling you what he said. I thought it was really interesting. We'll see if it proves to be true or not.
Well, thank you, Kim, and thank you very much for being with us today. And I thought this was a very informative conversation, and I hope that our listeners found it to be very helpful as well.
Thank you.
If you found this video to be helpful, please consider joining us for our weekly worship service. It's posted online each Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Central, and this week the Reverend D. Scott Cooper will be preaching. Thank you to our staff for making this video possible. It was produced by Christian Holmes. Alma Viscara assisted with the editing. See you all online soon and in person as soon as we can gather again. Please remember that no matter how isolated you feel, we are all in this together.